السيدات والسادة، رحبوا معنا بالسيد سامويل بيرك من قناة CNN وأعضاء جلسته النقاشية.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome from CNN, Samuel Burke and his panel.
Good afternoon. My name's Samuel Burke. I'm CNN's technology correspondent, and I want to jump right into it. We're going to be talking about the ecosystems here in the Middle East and North Africa, starting with Nick Eliovitz. He's the managing partner at Olive Tree Capital in the United States. Sitting next to him is Hassan Haider, partner at 500 Startups, a VC firm based in the United States. Noor Swaid is the founder of Global Ventures, a VC firm in the United Arab Emirates. Then on her left is Safdar Nazir. He's the VP for Digital Industries Strategies for the Middle East for Huawei, the Chinese telephone company. Then Hazam Ben Gassam, who is the head of corporate investment for InvestCorp. And finally, right next to me, Faraz Khalid, who is the CEO of Noon. So just before we get into the ecosystem, I've been out here reporting for the past couple of weeks, looking at some of the coolest startups that I've seen in a while. So I'm just interested, are there companies out here, a startup that maybe some of us don't know about, that catches your attention, that you think could be a big player? Quick answers.
I think Dirk is an interesting startup. They're in autonomous driving and safety space. They're in the Dubai Future Accelerator, and they're doing some interesting stuff there.
That's a very difficult question. It's like choosing who's my favorite child. We've done about 80 investments in the last year or so. I'm going to pass on that one.
Noor?
The latest transaction we did last week is in a company called Arrow Labs, which focuses on workforce mobility.
So we work to encourage a broad ecosystem, but some of the local partners that we're working with now are companies like Smart IoT on solutions in our open labs for the platform.
Hazem?
So Sam, I want to talk about a startup that's here in Bahrain that started 35 years ago, which is my firm, InvestCorp, which did choose in Bahrain 35 years ago to be its hub for its launch.
And Faraz?
I'm excited about a 4-month-old company called Noon, which is the homegrown e-commerce platform for the region. So yeah.
I had a feeling you might say that. So what we're really interested in is to find out which ecosystem here in the region is going to be the winner. Which model works best for this region? So Noor, I want to start out with you. Do you think that one country here has got it over another, or do you think it has to be different for every country?
I think that the dynamics are that it's one region and each country has something different to offer. So whereas some regulatory infrastructures might be better, you have talent pools in other parts of the region, you have markets that are larger in some countries, great universities in others. So I think that they all really complement each other, and as one region it works very well.
But what I keep on hearing from CEOs, especially when I'm in the United Arab Emirates, that Dubai is the right testing ground for them. That if you can make it in Dubai, then you can take that model and bring it other places. Fair?
Well, I think when you take a look at the data, what stands out is that most of the exits that have happened have come out of Dubai. So I would argue that it's probably a place where entrepreneurs feel they can scale and exit their businesses most easily.
Hassan?
I probably disagree with that statement. We're MENA-wide investors, so I'm on an airplane most of the time, and I think there's no single ecosystem that's emerged as the only one in the region. There's pockets of opportunity in different areas across the region. You've got Saudi Arabia as a massive market. The local talent's actually amazing. Egypt has probably the highest density of really amazing programmers and developers. Jordan has great product managers and one of the first markets to emerge. Bahrain probably is a better testing ground for the rest of the GCC. It's closer to Saudi in terms of population and customer sort of base. So I don't think there's any single market, single country, single city that's going to emerge as the one dominate. Like what people say that I hate is Silicon Valley of the Middle East. Like I hate that term. That's the worst thing that you could say to me. Each market has its own potential. Each market has its own opportunity, and I think that you really need to look at the MENA as a whole market rather than just focusing on a single ecosystem or market.
Nick, when you come out here and visit from the United States, is there something that you think the ecosystem is missing? Are there things that you're impressed to see that this ecosystem has that we don't necessarily have in the United States?
I would say that there's a lot of government support for some innovative areas and that require a lot of regulation in the United States that maybe in Dubai, for example, they're allowing to do things like with the Hyperloop and other areas that you couldn't necessarily accomplish without a lot of state regulations and government regulations at the federal level, interstate commerce, et cetera, that here you don't necessarily need. So I think that's an opportunity that's being taken advantage of to bring some fresh ideas and companies that are at the sort of a cusp of innovation. Yeah, I think that's a good enough example.
Faraz, you have a company that's straddling Saudi and UAE. So how do you see these ecosystems just between those two countries? Where do you think it's stronger?
Look, I think, sorry, I lost my voice. Yeah, I think to be successful in the GCC, you have to have a pan-GCC strategy. Any individual market is not big enough to attract the kind of talent you need to build an ecosystem. I feel like you need to reach out. So in our case, we have this unique experiment where Noon is headquartered in Saudi Arabia.
Why is it headquartered there?
Most of our customers are there. It is the biggest market in the region, makes the most sense. But most of our people right now are, in Dubai, and I think that's a function of where the talent is right now. But I think it's a little bit of a chicken and egg. There need to be these platforms or ecosystems that hone the talent to sort of be at a scale where they can get into the workforce. So I think, so for instance, in Riyadh, we're carving out 50% of the office space for an incubator. Basically, we're saying young startups should come and solve problems that we face as an e-commerce company. We'll fund them, we'll give them office space, we'll give them mentorship, but we'll also give them a challenge to solve. Hopefully we can acquire these companies at some stage, but so it's kind of like a captive incubator that we're building, and I think that probably could be a catalyst to sort of spark some of the innovation in that space.
Awesome. If you just had to choose one, just one, which ecosystem would you say other places should replicate in the Middle East and North Africa?
So first I'd say that each of the Gulf countries will find their own path, their own journey to what a venture capital private equity hub is for them.
That's very politically correct.
And we can't push, because each country has its own dynamics, whether it's universities, whether it's a consumer base, whether it's regulations and what have you. But the one thing coming back to the ecosystem, sometimes when we all talk about tech investing in the Gulf, we have in the back of our mind Silicon Valley. It's like, oh, why would you be successful in Bahrain and not why would you just do it in California? Fair enough. However, the right comparison is for the Gulf today compared to Silicon Valley in the 70s, because that is where the Gulf is today. They're just starting that journey of building a venture capital and growth capital community. And that will take time. And unfortunately, sometimes we're a bit impatient. We say, well, there's all these billion-plus tech startups in California, why bother in the Gulf? It's a journey which will take time. And the real test will be in 20, 30 years' time, how has the environment here provided the ecosystem for that? And that comes to the regulatory environment, to the government, to the public sector, to the private investors. But that ecosystem is starting today. And I think it's very exciting. And I would say the Gulf today is in a better position than Silicon Valley was in the 70s.
For what reason?
Because the entire, at least the way from my perspective as an investor, all constituencies are working hand in hand to make that successful. Whether it's the regulators, government agencies, public sector, entrepreneurs, students. Okay, every single constituency in that journey is anxious and excited to create this environment. And that, to me, is the winning formula. It is the right foundations.
Softer, you work for Huawei, the third largest smartphone maker in the world after Samsung and Apple. What does your company like that governments are doing out here? Is there something that a government has done, whether it's in Bahrain or the UAE, that's really helped grease the wheels for you to make the ecosystem a more fruitful place?
So firstly, depending on which month it is, we're actually second above Apple sometimes, depending on what's been launched. From an ecosystem perspective, why is it important to us? Is because we are a technology provider. Now, that technology is for a purpose to solve some problems. And we need the ecosystem and the local ecosystem to be able to develop solutions for the local market. So how do we encourage that? Firstly, we run a Seeds of the Future program to help educate, and even we take a good number of students from the region to China to be educated in Huawei's facilities and to do a knowledge transfer. What the governments in the region are doing is encouraging and working with us for that, and even in Bahrain here, we're working with the government for such programs and ICT skills competitions. What we've done in the region over the last couple of years is we've set up a regional open lab, which is an extension of our R&D facilities here, which allows local companies and local solution providers to work free of cost in our facilities and develop solutions. So they have free access to office space and data centers to develop solutions with us. And for example, some of the IoT type companies that are working in the region now are coming up with solutions which developed here are now being adopted by Huawei worldwide.
Noor, I want to start with you on this question, but anybody jump in at any point. Can you really scale a global company from here, from the Gulf region?
So I believe you can. InvestCorp's a great example. The company I previously scaled to IPO is another one. So that was a company I joined in 2005. By 2008, we were the largest in the world in what we did, based out of Dubai, did an IPO. So I think that it's been done before in different sectors. It might not have been done in tech, but that's just the newest sector for us to do it in. It doesn't mean it can't be done at all.
I think it's not important to be global. Like, I probably take a very different viewpoint on this. I think the MENA region is a market of about 300, 400 million people. It's big enough that it's about the same size as the US. It probably has a better demographic shift than the US. To be big in the MENA region is probably big enough for you to grow as a business, to actually take over the Middle East and North Africa. I mean, there's multi-billion-dollar businesses just in the US alone. Why should there not be multi-billion-dollar businesses just covering the MENA region alone? There's a much bigger opportunity. There's a lot more not done here that you can do as a startup in order to fill those gaps. So I think this whole vision of, be global is not as important to me as be regional and dominate the region, because I think that's a much more important and easier sort of ask than anything else that we could be looking for in startups.
Nick, listening to Hassan, it doesn't sound like he thinks you need an Amazon, a name that goes that big from the region for the region to have made it. Do you think that's fair? Do you think that we need to have a big name go to global scale before the region really sets its place on the global scale tech-wise?
Yeah, I think it's nice to have, but I mean, if you look at Finland, for example, they have Rovio, made Angry Birds. It was a huge gaming company, great success, global success, top on the App Store, brought notoriety to Finland's gaming ecosystem, and now they have, one of the most well-known gaming ecosystems, not that they didn't before that. So I do think these big global successes will help the ecosystem and attract foreign investors and attract more involvement from outsiders. So they're important, but they're not the end all, because like you've said, the market's huge here, and there's big enough markets in this region, and if they continue to integrate and do things on the policy level to make it more of a GCC than a single country, that'll be helpful. And then to your earlier question on which country would be the best suited, I mean, I'll take a stab and say, Saudi Arabia probably has the best chance because they have the largest labor force, they have a very talented labor force, and also they have capital, so they have both. And some of the other countries have a lot of capital, but not necessarily as large of labor forces. So I think they have the biggest opportunity, I would say.
So, Sam, I want to kind of give one example, which I think is relevant. In north of Finland, there's a small city called Oulu. Whoever knows Finland, it's very painful to get to. You get a flight to Helsinki, take a small plane, and it's painful in the winter, probably as close to the North Pole as it gets. Oulu is a significant hub for wireless technology. There's so many startups there. When it comes to mobility data, it's a fantastic business. Why is that? Nokia a long time ago established their R&D base in Oulu. And on the back of that has supported a lot of other businesses and startups in that area. My point is, if you would want to go live in Oulu and do a startup, you'll definitely want to come and live in the Gulf. Okay. Once you create that ecosystem, once you have that base, it will encourage innovation, it will encourage a lot of ideas, and it attracts people, and that will develop itself.
Why do you think people haven't invested here?
It's a journey we just got started. I think we're just at the beginning. As I said earlier, the Gulf today is Silicon Valley of the 70s.
But what do you think? People are just afraid of the political risks in the region? Why do you think there is hesitation from the West oftentimes are overlooking the businesses here in the Gulf because we see them. Every time I visit one of these countries, I see women starting their own companies in industries where they couldn't get a foot in the door before because oil was a man's business. You see people innovating to get around and to get up. So what do you think holds people back?
I think foreign investors is the secondary phase. The first phase needs to start with the locals. It needs to start with the local environment. Okay, and I think we owe it to ourselves, both as investors but as responsible citizens, to support the start of industries and sectors within the current economy. And this is the same in Africa, it's the same in Latin America and other parts. It needs to start with a local endogenous investor base, and the second generation will be the foreign investors.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think to that point, that's beginning to happen here. The company that I have the privilege of running raised $1 billion seed, right? That's probably the biggest seed round of venture capital to go into any business in the world. I think that's because the leadership in our region sees digital as a huge opportunity. The world is changing, they understand that. And I think it's for us to sort of now build businesses that deserve the kind of attention that, that deserve the attention from these investors. I think there's definitely a lot of will in the region to put money behind good ideas. And to your earlier point about, building global companies, now companies in the region, all small companies, all startups, all mid-sized companies have to compete with global companies. Amazon is here. The local Spotify has to compete with Spotify. The video streaming companies have to compete with Netflix. So you have to be as good as the global peers to actually have customer mindshare, because the customer doesn't care where you're from, they just need good service. So I feel like our region finally has the visibility of global we're on the radar, they're coming here, and we have to be good enough to compete with them. And I feel like it's a journey that we need to sort of embrace and start sort of acknowledging. I think it'll need capital to last year, Amazon put in $22 billion in R&D. $22 billion was invested by Amazon in R&D. And to compete with that is a mountain on its own.
I'm wondering what you think, Softer, are the biggest challenges talent-wise? Does a company like Huawei find enough talent out here? Where could the region improve? Where could governments like Bahrain invest to change the talent pool?
So talent acquisition is always a challenge for us, and that's partly why we run these programs like Seeds of the Future and the ICT Skills Competition, which has just started again this month. And so that's part of us needing to develop and wanting to develop the local talent. So I think that's moving in the right direction for us. But I think there's plenty of opportunity still in some of the emerging technologies. So Dubai is doing quite a bit on blockchain and has a plan for AI. We want to see more of this because for us, we see somebody asked a question this morning. I think it was Richard Quest saying, people are talking about the opportunity. Where's the opportunity? The opportunity is in digital transformation. That's the way we see it. We as an enabler from a technology perspective need the talent to develop solutions for digital transformation. We can encourage that, we can enable that. We have the platform to allow that to happen, but we can't do it ourselves. From our perspective, from an ecosystem point of view, we're quite happy taking 1% of the total value, right? So when we look at shared value, not necessarily shared values, but shared value, from a digital transformation perspective, I think there's a win-win for everybody, and we can't wait to see more and do whatever we can to encourage the development of local talent and local solutions, because it's more cost-effective for us to have that in place here.
Noor?
So I'd like to talk a little bit more about the foreign investing happening here. So we have seen a lot of the international players look at the region. We've seen some transactions. So we've had NEA come into Fetcher. We've had DD come into Kareem. I think that one thing that we're missing as a region is a matter of perspective. So we're fortunate enough to live in some of the best infrastructured cities globally, whether it's here in Bahrain or in Dubai. We have electricity that doesn't cut, and yet we are in the middle of emerging markets. So I think that as entrepreneurs start to think more along the lines of innovation front and think about the innovation risk associated with venture rather than just market risk and copycats in this part of the world, you'll see us addressing emerging market problems. So whether it's Fetcher that addresses last mile logistics using geotagging rather than addresses. And therefore NEA thinking, oh, well, this is interesting. This is actually a complete emerging market problem that solves a problem for 4 billion people. No one's going to sit in the valley and think about solutions for emerging market problems. We need to get off the whole, let's just copy what's happening elsewhere in our market, therefore we're reducing risk, and start really tackling things from an innovative perspective. And then you will have Tiger Global come in, which has already happened. You'll have NEA come in. You'll have Excel come in. All these people have invested in the region. They've just invested alongside others in innovative plays that address emerging markets that they can't address from their hometowns. So our challenge in getting more foreign investment here is really upping the game and showing people that we can be innovative. It's not just market risk.
And if you get that foreign investment, does that mean that it's always going to have to be an exit, basically?
All of those were into exit. So DD was not an exit, NEA was not an exit, Tiger was not an exit. When Lumia Capital comes in, it's not an exit. So these are actually foreign investors taking a look at the region. I think that the valuations here are very cheap. So when we invest in the region, we invest at multiples that people can't dream of in the US or in Europe. And so they see that there's just, multiple expansion, as well as the fact that this is actually a really interesting product, technology, or play on a new market that they don't have access to. But what it does require is local players putting their money down first. They're not going to come in here and invest in a silo. They're going to come in here and invest alongside the investors.
Hassan, you work with a VC firm, so you must love exits. So where do you see the exits here?
So one thing back, I'd like to take a conversation back a little bit. We've been talking about Silicon Valley in the 70s, but there's a much closer, in terms of timeline, market for us to compare ourselves to, which is Southeast Asia. We're literally 2 or 3 years behind the development of the Southeast Asian market. So when I take that as my sort of, whenever I go to Malaysia or Singapore or whatever, it's like going to the future 2 years, I'd be like, oh, this is what's going to happen in 2 years' time. It's pretty fun. But what that does, it shows me that actually, no, it's not the foreign investors that are going to build this ecosystem or that's going to invest in the startups that are going to do well. It's the local players that are actually going to be the ones that emerge first. And they're going to be the ones that are more dominant and are going to continue to be dominant. I mean, in Southeast Asia, the majority of investors are Southeast Asian investors. They started with small seed funds, they continued to Series A funds, now they're in Series B. They've done multiple funds over the last 5 or 6 years. And I think that's the same evolution that we're going to see here. The guys like Sequoia and these guys came in a bit later. They raised funds for those markets. But they don't really care that much about those markets, and it's not priority to them. Sequoia is still very interested in Silicon Valley more than anywhere else, in Silicon Valley and China. So I think for me, it's nice for these guys to come in and invest. It validates what we're doing. But really what we need to build our own ecosystem is our own investors and our own sort of funding ecosystem and life cycle. And that's what's missing. Like, that's seriously what's missing in this region. Startups don't get enough funding. We have 10x less funds than we need across the MENA region. They don't get funding because there's not enough venture capital funding. There's not enough venture capital funds because there's not enough LPs. There's like no one investing in the asset class. And that's like you have to take that down. Like, who are the investors? Who should we be talking to? And you go in and you're like, there's two real pools of capital in the region. There's sovereign funds, which, every time I've spoken to sovereign fund, they're like, oh, your fund is too small. We can only do a minimum check of $50, $100 million into larger funds. But our ecosystem doesn't need that. It needs much smaller investments just to get started. And so what Bahrain's done with the fund of funds has been an amazing sort of example of, it doesn't need that much funding in order to kickstart something. It can be done with $100 million. Then the other pool of capital is really the private sector, right? Private sector is cautious. Private family offices want to invest in real estate, in industry, in things they can touch and feel. So venture capital feels risky. Investing in tech is something that's really anathema to them. And then earlier this morning, someone was talking about long memories. And to this day, I go and talk to some families, and they're like, we got burnt in 2000, so we're not doing venture capital again. I'm like, that's 18 years ago. There's kids that were born then, and now we're 18 years old.
A lot has changed since then.
Yeah, it's been an interesting market.
I just want to ask you quickly, since you are Bahraini and we're here in Bahrain, where do you see this country fitting in the puzzle of the ecosystem of startups, of growth in this region?
I think Bahrain has a very interesting niche to play. It's a market that understands the GCC as a whole. There's a big Saudi component to the local market as well. I remember when I had a startup, I'd market locally, but I'd have people from the Eastern Province come and want my product. And so being a petri dish or a testing ground for the rest of the GCC makes sense for Bahrain. And so I don't think Bahrain should go after Series B and Series C stage startups at the later stages. I think they need to go earlier and playing a role in enabling Egyptian, Moroccan, Tunisian, Lebanese, Jordanian startups to expand into the GCC using Bahrain as a testing ground. I think that's where we can play a role as a country. And I think that's sort of the mandate and direction with all the new accelerators that are being launched, all of the new funds and everything that's happening, is sort of focused on that earlier stage.
If anybody has any questions, I'm going to come down, but I just wanted to see, Hassam, if you can respond to that. Do you see Bahrain in the same puzzle piece?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would add that venture capital and startups, it's a young people's game. So the more Bahrain and other countries you see can either expand the university base to attract talent from outside Bahrain to come and study here, or expand the appeal of Bahrain as a country for those young generations to come in and experiment and start new businesses and what have you. So I think in that respect, it's terrific.
Okay, we have a question in the audience from Mr. Kumar.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yep. In one of the earlier sessions on oil and gas, they spoke about not just exporting oil and gas, but try to do more of manufacturing and value add, and therefore create more jobs in the region by leveraging your natural resources. So what it meant also was the need for looking at the fourth industrial revolution, looking at robotics, process automation, and to doing things to enhance, to improve the productivity, and therefore do better things for the economy. So local relevance of technology probably is in adoption and consumption of those kind of higher levels of technology to improve and value add what you have as your asset, raw material, oil and gas, for example. So I don't think this whole discussion about e-commerce and tech companies like Silicon Valleys that turn things around in multiples are probably the way to go. What's important is to do something which is probably locally relevant in terms of what assets you have and how do you leverage your economies here in the fourth industrial revolution to manufacture more with better efficiency using technology and artificial intelligence.
Well, I think we heard some of that on the panel. You want to pick that up?
Yeah, let me take that one directly, because one of my goals for this year is to start developing the 5G ecosystem. So if you've heard about 4G, 5G is the next tech trend, which is coming, not just that, it's going to really revolutionize the way we enable connectivity. And recently we just launched the Huawei Global Connectivity Index, in which Bahrain did improve its ranking from 41 out of the 80 countries that we look at. Again, in the region, UAE is ranked the highest at, I think, 24 from our calculations. Now, 5G is all about industry transformation. So one of those key industries around Industry 4.0 and manufacturing. Now, manufacturing overall is not big in the Middle East region, especially in discrete parts manufacture. From a process industry, yes, we do have in oil and gas and in aluminium. So if you or anybody in this room has a particular interest in helping to develop the Industry 4.0 ecosystem, come and speak to me.
But I just have to say, for anybody who doesn't know, I mean, for me, the place that 5G stands out the most is how it will be able to interact with smart infrastructure and self-driving cars. When I've seen examples of that at the Consumer Electronics Show, all of a sudden the need for 5G starts to make sense. That, okay, this car will need to communicate with the stoplight, so that's where the 5G infrastructure comes in. But to Mr. Kumar's question, do you think that building that relevance here will put the ecosystem at an advantage over every other market that's trying to get a hold of 5G, Noor?
So I'd like to address that from a different perspective. So if you think about, oil and gas being the assets that we had 30, 40 years ago, the biggest asset that the region has now is its youth. I don't think there's anyone in this room that's under 30, but half of the population in MENA is. And that's not something that can be replicated overnight. That's something that can be viewed as a liability, or that's something that can be viewed as an asset. We graduate 110,000 engineers a year. Are they the right type of engineers? Are they skilled enough? That's our job to educate them. But that is an asset, and the question is, how do we mobilize that as an asset? How do we leverage that as an asset? The way that I believe is best is through the digital economy, because this asset is very digital in and of itself.
But part of the challenge with that asset is the education system in the region itself. And at having this discussion earlier, is that a lot of the education, even from a school level, you'll notice that a lot of it is learning by rote. Now, the computers will learn far faster than you ever can, and they can recall that knowledge far faster and far better than you ever can. So the focus of education has to shift to being able to use and some of the softer skills and artistic skills around innovation and thinking differently rather than acquiring knowledge.
Any other questions? Okay, I'll come down to you.
Thank you, Chaz. So the ecosystem in regards to the startup, it has the pillars, and those pillars that has been identified even by the EDB in regards to Startup Bahrain. So it's the cooperates, which is in larger extent happening, the education in less extent, the accelerators, many of them are across the road, as well as the regulation. But then when it comes to this panel, it is really the funding, which is the gap. Now, when Qasim came and said the preferred location for startups will be in here in this region, what would someone ignore the top 10 startup ecosystem in the world in the Genome report, and will be thinking about this region and ignore those 10 top 20? So it's the funding gap, which I think are missing in here, because we've got so many startups, they get filling their capex for a year, but there are no future round for them. And then in regards to the oil and gas, very quick, we've run a boot camps last year for oil and gas startups, and we were shocked and surprised. 20 startups announced from Bahrain and Saudi, and they're all in the bracket of $100,000 investment, and that's oil and gas.
Anybody want to respond to that? We have about 2 minutes left.
I mean, I would say spot on, but the old saying, success breeds success. And only in the last 5 years, there's some tech startups which have been very successful in the Gulf. I hope Noon will be another one. And when that's successful, it's going to inspire others, going to inspire both entrepreneurs to start businesses and investors to put in more capital. So it is that journey which is just getting started, and it's going to take time. But that is where the public and the local private sector should play an important role in bridging that gap.
Can I quantify that gap?
Of course.
So these numbers might be familiar to some of you, but so the gap is 10x, as was mentioned before, and what that means is, if you take a look at Europe or the US, they invest between 0.2 and 0.3% of GDP per capita in VC every year. As a region, you can take Saudi, UAE, Bahrain, we fall somewhere between 0.02 and 0.03% of GDP per capita. If you want to quantify that in dollar terms, that's $1.2 billion in the UAE, $1.4 billion in Saudi Arabia, would get us to the same level as the US in percentages. It's not a large amount of money, but as you mentioned, it's so hard for the entrepreneurs to actually find the funding. It's so hard for the VCs to find the funding. And so there is a massive funding gap, and it's just not a very large quantum.
Before I thank the panel, I just want to go through some of the announcements that we have today. Al Sahel Resort announced the development of a new 5-star resort on the southwest coast of Bahrain. It's the first phase of the Al Sahel development. Jumeirah Group, the global hospitality company and a member of Dubai Holding, has already signed a hotel management agreement to operate a luxury Jumeirah hotel and spa. Ajamira, Mayfair Global Realty, 2 leading Indian developers, have come together to announce a $250 million project in the Bahrain Bay development to offer the tallest residential towers in Bahrain, called the Golden Gate Towers. And by 2025, the kingdom aims to provide 5% of its electrical power supply through renewable energy, equivalent to 250 megawatts. Bahrain is significantly expanding opportunities in the energy sector in line with the Kingdom's National Renewable Energy Action Plan. And a new announcement that we're just going to have for the first time right here, the announcement of the Fund of Funds. Bahrain Development Bank is announcing the launch of a $100 million venture capital fund of funds. The Al Waha Fund of Funds will support Middle East startups and will invest VC funds that have a presence in Bahrain. And lastly, there is a Dine With Us in Al Adliya tonight, so there are going to be buses here, so you can go to a bunch of different restaurants of your choice. So meet us at the buses, and we'll go out and have dinner this evening. Hassam, Nick, Hassan, Faraz, Safter, and Noor, thank you very much for joining me on stage.
Thank you.